Thank you very much, Marianne. And great to see all of you. And Ambassador Pelletier has been a great friend of the council since he got to Houston. We're lucky to have him here in Houston. Any of you have any connection with U of H, an incredible program. He's basically running and energizing kind of all the international oriented efforts and coordinating them for both American students looking to go abroad or foreign students come to University of Houston. And to bring it back to your long distinguished career, Ambassador, with the United States, you have, for tonight's topic, you have a long and deep, number of years of experience, multiple diplomatic postings in India. As Marianne mentioned, you're Deputy Chief of Mission. That is the second highest ranking diplomat for the United States in India at one point. But perhaps before we get to the recent flare-up of Indian and Pakistani kind of tensions back here in May, can we maybe discuss kind of where and how some of these decades long-standing tensions have come from? And maybe in particular, something people might have heard about, perhaps don't really know a lot about, if they've heard about 1947, the partition of India, the end of British rule. It's done very hurriedly. Initially, it's supposed to be over a year and a half. The Lord Mountbatten speeds it up on his own timeline. He cuts off about a year of that. He gives people 2 months' notice to basically say we're creating 2 whole new countries, whole new borders. Leads to arguably the largest mass migration ever in world history. Estimates about 15 million people moved and or forcibly had to move, oftentimes depending upon whether you're Hindu or Muslim. At least probably 1 million, perhaps as high as 2 million people die either from violence or starvation or disease. Can you talk about partition and maybe the legacy of what it did to start the relations between these 2 newly created countries and maybe how it still echoes today?
Sure. Yep. First, let me just say thank you. I've been a huge fan of the World Affairs Council since I moved to Houston 4 years ago. And so I'm really, really pleased and honored to be part of this. And then given 30 some odd years of training in the State Department, let me also start by saying I retired from the State Department, so I do not speak for the U.S. government. And while I work at the University of Houston, I'm here on my own. I do not speak for the University of Houston. And my kids got very used to me saying that when I was a U.S. government spokesperson. Like I always had to make clear what was what. So speaking on my own. But really, really pleased to be here and to talk about a subject that's very near and dear to my heart, very important to me, both professionally and personally. I think it's you've got to start somewhere, and I think 1947 is a good place to start. But it's important, I think, to understand that the subcontinent, as part of the British Raj and even before, has hundreds and hundreds of years and thousands of years of mixed up history and different peoples engaging in different ways, different kingdoms and whatnot. When the British split the subcontinent into Pakistan, which at that point, remember, was West and East Pakistan, so it was Bangladesh, what is now Bangladesh, as well as Pakistan, from India, the trauma of that is perhaps most easily understood when you think about the partition, where at independence, literally millions of Hindus and Sikhs and others left Pakistan and moved to India, leaving their families, their histories, their goods, their houses behind. And millions of people left India to go to Pakistan. That was the most traumatic, perhaps, and the most visible part of the trauma. But ripping the country, the country apart that way was also very traumatic. And to this day, in India and in Pakistan, or in the United States or Canada or Australia or so many other parts of the world, you run into Indian families, Pakistani families, subcontinental families, for whom that initial trauma remains fresh and remains real. It's sort of like talking to Palestinians who talk about having to have fled Palestine and how generations later that reality is still very real. And so you will I went to dinners and to events in India, and you would sit down and people would tell you the story of partition. They would say, when my family was forced to move to Mumbai from Karachi, or when my family was forced to move from Karachi to Mumbai, that was such a definitional moment, that I think it does remain still very important, even as now, many, many years later, we start to see the trajectory of India and the trajectory of Pakistan going in very, very different ways.
And maybe just to help people understand the complexity of it, obviously what was, the Indian subcontinent had, a very large number of Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, but, also Jains, Christians, everything else. But in particular, there may have been issues before with the kind of, particularly Muslims and Hindus in certain areas. But how did it escalate and get to this point that perhaps no one expected? The British probably knew they were desperate to get out. They had gotten through World War II. They're still struggling. They know they can't keep this empire anymore. But probably nobody saw the levels of violence that were on both sides. I mean, that's the hard part about this. This is equally horrific crimes committed on both sides of this. There was no order that Muslims had to move to India, or Hindus had to, or sorry, Muslims had to move to Pakistan, or Hindus had to move to India. But a lot of people were doing it out of just fear and desperation. Can you explain that process and maybe the legacy of it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so Jinnah's idea from the beginning was that a homeland where Muslims would be the majority, where Muslims would be safe, was needed. And that those areas where Muslims were the majority were East and West Pakistan. So East and West Pakistan were very much established to be a safe homeland for Muslims from the subcontinent, whereas India was very much set up with the intent of being a pluralistic, diverse democracy. And so the sense of identity in India was very much like, no, but we welcome everybody and we're going to include multitudes. A lot of the things that you think of when you think of the United States and are similar sort of talking points. And so the idea that somehow Muslims needed to flee for their safety was a wound to Indians who believed, like the Mahatma, who believed that this was going to be a secular, diverse democracy. On the flip side of it, many Muslims felt very strongly that they had been discriminated against for years. They had there was violence propagated against them for many years, and that they needed to be safe. And so I think the depth of those feelings perhaps was underestimated, perhaps was well known, and the British decided they just needed to go home. So I think those sort of definitional differences between what Indians saw their country as becoming and what Pakistanis saw their country as providing were very, very deeply held and led to not just the horrors of partition, but then, of course, the swinging back and forth in the bilateral relation between India and Pakistan ever since.
And obviously, there might have been difficulty anyway, but with the massive number of deaths, the mass killings on both sides, sadly, mass rapes, kidnapping of young women on both sides, both sides kind of hardest elements saying we need a strong military, we need a strong defense. We don't know where India is going, we don't know where Pakistan's going, especially in Pakistan's case because it's a much, much smaller country, much smaller population. Can you talk about how not long afterwards, the first of four major wars between the two countries and other skirmishes since then occurs? Three of them are related to the Kashmir and the difficulties with regards to Kashmir. One is we talk about the separation and creation of Bangladesh, but maybe just how very quickly those tensions escalate into full-blown wars and wars that have continued for many years since then.
So if you look at the first war, right after independence, was over Kashmir. When the British withdrew, India became independent, Pakistan became independent, but there were also a number of kingdoms throughout the region which were given the choice of which way they wanted to go. Now, for most of them, the choice was pretty obvious. Hyderabad, for example, though ruled by a Muslim ruler, was right in the middle of India. Would have been a little unrealistic to say we're going with Pakistan. The most problematic, probably, kingdom involved was Kashmir, where the Maharaja was a Hindu, but the vast majority of his subjects were Muslim. And so he initially said, I'm going to stay independent. But very soon after 1940, the independence, a group of Lashkars, which is warriors, insurgents from Pakistan, went in and said, we're going to take over Kashmir. The Maharaja of Kashmir opted at that point to join with India. History is still a little unclear whether the Indian troops who were going to, quote unquote, help him had actually crossed the border into Kashmir at that point or not. How independent was that decision of his when your back is up against the wall and India is offering you help? Are you really free to say no? How much was involved is still unclear to history. But basically, India came in to support the ruler of Kashmir and the kingdom of Kashmir against this infiltration from Pakistan. And then the war broke out. And what you've seen since then in Kashmir in particular is a series of clashes and tensions and talks and agreements, followed by more clashes and violence, followed by more talks and agreements, and India moving ever towards trying to make Kashmir a totally integrated, quote unquote, normal part of India, to greater or lesser degrees of success. But what you've also seen is that wild swing, frankly, from violence and wars, for wars, to talks and agreements and cooperation, to more violence and wars. You could make a timeline of India and Pakistan relations that would show nothing but violence every so often. But you could also make a timeline of India-Pakistan relations that would show a series of negotiations and agreements and talks. And so it's very kind of hard to follow and hard to keep up with.
And to bring the United States into it, because obviously you're an expert on the U.S.'s approach to India and Pakistan and the whole region. Can you explain how it would probably maybe surprise people? A lot of people know that, say, for much of the Cold War and perhaps even afterwards, the United States had much better relations with the Islamic Republic of Pakistan than with the, at least then, secular, country of India. And maybe, especially in regards to India, how much of that colonial legacy and the kind of mass distrust of European colonialism and the British, maybe the U.S. get lumped into that, how India kind of wanted to forge its own path, and in a lot of ways had better relationships with the Soviet Union than later Russia than the U.S.
So India under Jawaharlal Nehru was one of the real founders and one of the real great thinkers of the whole non-aligned movement. The idea that now all these countries that have gained independence in the 40s and 50s and 60s, we don't need to choose either or, the Soviet Union or the United States. We have an opportunity to forge our own path and be non-aligned and be in the middle. And that, again, became a really definitional and really important part of India's identity and India's self-definition. Pakistan, on the other hand, took the route of being part of the U.S. system during the initial part of the Cold War to set up regional alliances, basically encircling the Soviet Union, to help fight the communism and the spread of communism, etc. So early on, Pakistan and the U.S. were quite well aligned, and the U.S. had a really hard time swallowing this idea of non-alignment. Either you're with us or you're against us. How can you be non-aligned? And that, I think, was built on over the years as India developed really good relations with the Soviet Union, had a very strong, in particular, defense relationship with the Soviet Union, which actually in some ways continues to this day, where India uses a lot of Russian arms and Russian material. And so during the 50s and 60s, the assumption was that the US was backing Pakistan and India was non-aligned, but the US understood that really to mean aligned with the Soviet Union. And when that really sort of started to shift in some ways, and this may not seem obvious, was in 1971 when East Pakistan broke off and became Bangladesh. And the Nixon administration very much sided with Pakistan. They believed Pakistani unity was really important as a foreign policy goal. India went in to support Bangladesh and to support its fight for freedom against Pakistan, for obvious reasons. And that was a particularly difficult point. But I think at that point also you saw some of the real atrocities committed by West Pakistani troops against Bangladeshis and Bangladeshi civilians. There's a very famous telegram in the Foreign Service. The U.S. Foreign Service, there is a certain number of very famous telegrams which sort of define key moments of foreign policy. And there was the Blood telegram. Mr. Blood was the consul general in Dhaka to East Pakistan at that time. And he wrote and talked about some of these atrocities and talked about what the U.S. position was vis-a-vis Pakistan and Bangladesh. And so at that point, you had the Nixon administration, also because they didn't much like Indira Gandhi, but very much backing Pakistan and Pakistani unity. But once East Pakistan broke off and became Bangladesh, then I think from the 70s onwards, you start to see things change a little bit.
And then to kind of get to more recent times and really pretty dramatic swings from kind of historical U.S. relations with each country. Obviously the 1980s, the Afghan war against, the Soviets, Mujahideens, the Pakistanis are our best partner, especially in terms of getting weapons and people in and out of Afghanistan. The 90s, we have obviously horrific issues with the Taliban, difficulties, but when the U.S. invades Afghanistan, and for many, many years, Pakistan is essential, sometimes duplicitous, but essential partner in terms of our war effort there. Obviously, the United States has pulled out of Afghanistan a few years ago. So how has that need or dependency on Afghanistan or Pakistan changed? And then similarly, obviously, the Cold War ended a good number of years ago. India and U.S. relations getting better and better all the time, especially in terms of a common shared concern about China. Can you talk about kind of the evolution of each of those relationships?
So, and with apologies, a gross oversimplification of it, but I think what you started to see from those sort of 70s, early 80s on is an increasing influence by Islamic hardliners in Pakistan, including in members and senior members of the army and the ISI, the security services in Pakistan, who were more and more influenced by Islam and a hard line on Islam, and who were using Islam in order to consolidate their own control over Pakistan. At the same time, what you started to see in India was a growing commercial strength and a growing economic strength, which then, of course, has really taken off in the past 15 to 20 years. And then, so you actually started to see this kind of diversion of interests between what was happening in Pakistan and what was happening in India. And in a way, again, an oversimplification, but in a way, the key themes with US and India became very kind of positive themes of how do we build trade? How do we build commerce? You saw huge back and forthing between people of Indian origin coming to the United States, studying and working and contributing to the economy and to the society in the United States. Whereas in Pakistan, it was more about how do we fight the Taliban? How do we fight Islamic fundamentalism and Islamic terrorism at the same time that we're working with a government and a military that is increasingly influenced by these same folks, which is, again, a simplification, but Osama bin Laden was found where? He was found in Abbottabad in Pakistan, right in the heart of the military heartland of Pakistan, showing the sort of very twisted and difficult relationships there.
And I suppose just, in that vein, again, I don't want to oversimplify things, but the last 25 years, from a Pakistani perspective, they might say to the United States only needs us or uses us because of Afghanistan or because of countering terrorism. I've spoken to countless Americans, men and women who fought in Afghanistan or intelligence service or diplomatic services, who would say Pakistan was our greatest, at best, kind of difficult ally, in a lot of ways, duplicitous ally behind the scenes, supporting a lot of the exact same fundamentalist terrorist groups that we're trying to fight. What was the level of American frustration with Pakistan, really, especially during the Afghan war?
I mean, I think you were right earlier when you noted how much the U.S. relied on and needed Pakistan to fight the war in Afghanistan. The Pakistanis were aware of that, and I think there was always a cost to be paid for that partnership, if you will. It's a funny use of the word partnership, but if you will. But there was also, I mean, there is also a strong, in some ways, a strong relationship between Pakistan and the United States. So there were students going back and forth. There were business interests. There's also a humanitarian interest, and we've seen the U.S. really be a very important partner to Pakistan in terms of going in during some of the humanitarian crises, the flooding or earthquakes, etc. So, I mean, it was a difficult relationship. It is a difficult relationship. I would say, using my broader experience in the Foreign Service, all partnerships like that are difficult. I mean, we have our difficulties with Canada. We have our difficulties with Britain. I mean, that's to be expected. But I think it got more and more difficult over time with Pakistan. Probably the U.S. asks also became greater and greater over time on Pakistan. And so there was, I think, a certain resentment within Pakistan that the U.S. was only there for transactional reasons and was kind of a fair weather friend, which is why you see the term now when people talk about the Chinese friendship and alliance with Pakistan, where China is an all-weather friend. I mean, that's kind of a dig at the United States for being a fair weather friend.
And I want to turn to India next, but just can you maybe help people understand this is one of the most militarily dominated governments of a significant country in the world since World War II, probably maybe comparable to Egypt or something like that. The military, the intelligence services, ISI, either directly dominate the government or are seen as kind of puppet masters pulling the strings. I think since independence, Pakistan has never had a prime minister serve all 5 years of their term, I think. Can you talk about why it is that a military government was able to be so dominant and why they are still so dominant?
I mean, I have my theories, right? And if you think about it, from the beginning, from 1947, Pakistan was set up to be not India, was set up in opposition in some ways to India. And so that idea of national defense from the beginning was incredibly important, right? And then that was reinforced, of course, when you had the war against or the war for Bangladeshi independence, where again, then you had India actually backing the Bangladeshis in their fight against West Pakistan. You also have the case, and this was true in both India and in Pakistan at the time of independence, where the class of army officers in particular were very well educated, very well placed, very cosmopolitan, and very powerful. In India, the trajectory took them in a different direction. In Pakistan, having that class of people who also had that really important national role, I think just became more and more important.
And turning to India and kind of similarly kind of notable transitions, but in different ways. As you noted, when India was founded, sadly, Gandhi was killed not long after the events of India. He was actually killed by a Hindu extremist, by RSS member, the same organization that Narendra Modi is a member of, and kind of indirectly ideologically aligns with BJP, his major party. But India went from the world's largest democracy, which it still is, but a vocally secular and inclusive form of government, perhaps like Pakistan, that's sometimes dominated by the Congress Party, but more open and receptive, probably of minorities for the first number of decades than say in the last 10 or 20 years. Where are we now in India, especially in terms of if you're a Muslim living in India, in an increasingly Hindu-centric country, one where Hindu nationalists are extremely vocal. Modi, at best, is not talking them down, and at worst, sometimes is supporting the rhetoric, what they say. His own legacy when he's leading the Gujarat of what he may or may have known about a massive, killing of Muslims there. What's the state of democracy, and especially for inclusion of Muslims now in India?
Well, like I said again, and why it's a good idea to start with the history and start going back to 1947. So from the beginning, the idea was that India was a diverse, secular democracy. And initially, the importance of reinforcing the rights of minorities and reinforcing the systems which would allow for that diverse secular democracy to thrive were really, really essential. And then in some ways, which may well rhyme with some of the things that we hear in the United States or in Western Europe now, at a certain point, opposition, which at that point was mostly the BJP, started to say, well, you're catering too much to these minorities. What about majority rights? You're catering so much to the Muslims, but 80% of us are Hindus. What about the Hindus? And so, as in anything in life, when there's a pendulum, you started to have more and more people talk about the need for protecting majority rights. You started to hear more and more people talk about, well, Congress, which at that point was the ruling party, is just using the Muslims as a vote bank. Heard similar accusations about the Democratic Party in the United States, for example. And so what ended up happening eventually was the Modi government's actually the second BJP government. You had an initial government, a BJP government. The Bharatiya Janata Party is the sort of the Hindu nationalist. A lot of people don't like using that term. A lot of BJPers don't like using that term. Government. They then were replaced by another party, and now, of course, Narendra Modi has been elected as prime minister. And you do hear a lot of people talk about a lot more sort of emphasis on the Hindu majority, emphasis on majority rights, emphasis on not using the minorities as a vote bank. Where does that cross the line is always a question that people are going to ask. I mean, for the moment, India is still the largest democracy in the world. They have regular elections. They have a loud and raucous press. You have a lot of efforts by people to get around that, to keep them down. You have lawsuits. Again, not unlike the country we currently live in. That's part of democracy. It's a mess. If democracy is functioning right, it's going to be really messy. And India is many, many things, and messy is probably one of them. So,
and as we discussed, sadly, there've been 4 major wars, multiple moments of escalation and kind of conflict, and in the years in between all those wars. Looking at what happened in May, probably not surprising that it centered around Kashmir. The Indians accused the Pakistanis of knowing or at least tolerating an Islamic terrorist group in Pakistan, based in Pakistan, to kill a large number of mostly Hindus in Kashmir. Can you talk about that recent spiral of escalation and maybe how those tensions were brought down? Because the U.S. behind the scenes presumably played more of a role maybe than we might know. And secondarily, obviously, for a number of years, they've both been nuclear powers. What's the degree of difficulty and tension that gives to you, say, as an American diplomat, when that is what's on the line?
So the attacks on the Indian tourists in Kashmir in May in many ways reflect a lot of the violence that you've seen between Pakistan and India ever since independence, where a terrorist group with backing, whether openly or not openly, from groups in Pakistan, whether that includes the government of Pakistan or not. We don't always have clear lines, but go into India and attack a group of Indian civilians, leading to the necessity for some sort of backlash and some sort of response from the Indians, because democracies work that way. And so you did see then the Indians respond with stronger attacks against military targets in Pakistan than had been seen previously. And then since then, you've seen a continued higher level of tension. In particular, one thing that not everybody's talking about, but that could be really significant, is that India has said they're withdrawing from the Indus Water Pact, which is the pact between India and Pakistan about the use of the waters of the Indus River, which is obviously control of water resources is hugely important. The Pakistanis have said any fiddling with the Indus Water Pact would be an act of war. The Indians have said we're not going back to the Indus Water Pact. So those tensions remain really strong. I would say it's interesting also in terms of international relations, where the Indians felt that Turkey, for example, was far too sympathetic to the Pakistani side of the argument after this attack in May. And so they've had some very tense relationships with Pakistan. And then just in the past month or so, you've seen the Indian government's claim or accuse the Chinese government of having supported the Pakistani government with information and intel and whatnot during that event, ratcheting up again the tensions between India and Pakistan. So it was kind of in line with some of the sorts of violence one has seen since independence. You're seeing it affect not just India-Pakistan relations, but India's relations with the other countries that are important to it. And what, slowly you will start to see then talks behind the scenes, and how do we start to ratchet down the tensions until the tensions ratchet up again. Which gets to the second part of your question. Often, and I think responsibly so, friends of India and Pakistan, friends of avoiding nuclear war in the region, do go and talk to India and Pakistan, usually quietly and behind the scenes. Diplomacy, unfortunately for diplomats who don't then get credit for anything, diplomacy usually works best when nobody knows it's happening. And so those quiet talks behind the scenes can be very effective. What happens when you take a very public role or make public statements is both the Indians and the Pakistanis, but particularly the Indians, tend to get their backs up. We're not children. You don't need to tell us what to do. They don't like to be seen. They're a big, powerful country. They don't want to be seen as kowtowing to anyone's interests, even if it's in their own interest as well. And so this is a prime example of a case where behind the scenes, quiet diplomacy can work very effectively. Public diplomacy may not necessarily be the best tool in one's toolbox.
And not to try and have a negative perspective, but obviously they both are nuclear armed countries. Even beyond that, they both have large military capabilities that they've used before. But maybe one thing that's gradually changing is from the Pakistani side, if they cannot kind of move beyond a military and intelligence ISI dominated government that is willing to work with Islamists, some of who may or may not have direct coordination to carry out attacks in India, something can happen again. And from the India perspective, if we have an increasingly Hindu nationalist perspective in terms of foreign policy, Modi is still very popular, and presumably he's pretty good health. He's going to be around for a long time. If this is a more kind of globally aggressive country and a country wanting to put its mark on the world and say we'll only take so much, do you think another conflict is likely in the next few years, and maybe that it could be worse?
So I'll say something which is not mainstream and is my own personal point of view, but is based on things that I've heard many people say, on both from Pakistanis and from Indians, including some very influential Indians, which is, both countries are at this point nuclear powers. That said, they're also not crazy. they know what would happen if there were a nuclear war in the region. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, one of the Congress prime ministers from before, used to say his vision was eventually creating a South Asia where you could have breakfast in Delhi and lunch in Karachi and dinner in Kabul. Because that's actually, if you had a good road, that would actually be possible. That's how close everything is to each other. And so Indians and Pakistanis are incredibly aware of this. And if you tried to set off a nuclear bomb in any one of those places, the fallout would hit all of those places. So, yes, there is danger of the tensions. And yes, there are definitely tensions. But there are also a lot of people who understand just how devastating to all sides any escalation would be.
Okay. And just before I turn to the audience questions, just to kind of sum up where the U.S.'s view and with these relationships and its perspective in that part of the world, perhaps more on India, but just quickly with regards to Pakistan. Obviously, sadly, Taliban is back in power. A horrific development, especially most oppressive governments in the world, maybe it in North Korea. Can you explain, I suppose, the continuing importance of Pakistan in terms of American, regional efforts and foreign policy, but maybe most importantly in terms of the growing importance of India, especially in terms of the U.S. and India both wanting to kind of balance the rise and power of China, and maybe if you could talk about. People might have heard about the Quad, this kind of loose, not formal, but kind of collaboration between India, Japan, US, and Australia.
So, I mean, with Pakistan, as I said earlier, our interests are not just about Afghanistan or Islamic fundamentalism or Islamic terrorism. They're about Pakistan. They're about trying to build stability in the region, which also then includes commercial and economic development, which would be really important for Pakistan. There's also the humanitarian side to it, which, again, the more you have actual commercial and trade development and economic development, the more the Pakistanis can do a lot of their own humanitarian assistance. But I think it's important to recognize that, like with any country, the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan is actually multi-featured. And I think it would be a mistake to try to just pin it on Afghanistan or on that element to things. That said, since the 90s, 2000s, and beyond, since India's economic opening up, you've seen a real huge leap in terms of economic and commercial developments in India, and a huge, therefore, leap in the partnership between the US and India. When I was kind of reviewing some stuff and getting ready for this evening, I saw a recent statement that one of the goals that India and the US have set for each other is to double the amount of trade from 250 billion to 500 billion. Trade with Pakistan is 9 billion. 9 billion is a lot of money. 250 or 500 billion is just not even on the same planet. And so that sort of strong and ever-growing partnership between India and the United States really just I think leads to something that we actually used to talk a lot about, which is sort of delinking India, US, Pakistan. India and US have a relationship. The US and Pakistan have a relationship, but they don't have to be linked together necessarily. And particularly because I think when you look at the depth and breadth of the U.S. relationship with India these days, it just blows the mind. I remember, I'll just share one story from when I was in Delhi. At one point, I was the deputy, and the ambassador called me in, and he said, it was a line in a speech somebody had written for him, where he said, India and the U.S. cooperate in all aspects of human endeavor. He's like, fact check that for me. Is it true? And I went and I started doing the fact checking, and I called the whole country team, and we all looked. And I called him and I said, I found something. I said, we do not have a bilateral agreement on transportation. We have something with every other ministry, every other secretary in the U.S. We don't have transportation. And I'm not kidding you when I say 2 or 3 days later, I got a message saying the Secretary of Transportation wants to come to Delhi. We're signing something on highway safety and a joint partner. So I called the ambassador. All right, you can put the line back in the speech. We now literally do everything. And that is how strong and how broad and how deep the US-India relationship is.
I just some of these questions, if they're kind of similar issues, I'll combine them. I suppose just regards to India and Pakistani tensions. Siddharth, student asks, do you believe or how should India negotiate a military dominated with a military dominated Pakistan? Is the outspoken approach of Indian diplomats such as Jay Shankar the right way to go? And somewhat related to that, VJ asks with regards to nuclear tensions with two countries. What do you think are some of the ways to permanently de-escalate the situation? How the rest of the world somehow bands together and forces these two nations to sign a no first use of nukes agreement. What do you think there? What's possible?
Yeah. I would never call the foreign minister Jay Shankar outspoken, but that's an interesting word. I think it's important to go at this with a certain level of humility. Let me answer in that way. India is a mature country with its own political system, its own political dynamics. Same with Pakistan. I think it's important for friends and others who wish the best, not just for the two of them, but for the region and the world, to quietly sort of encourage the best behavior and encourage and support movements in the right direction, in the direction of peace and cooperation. I don't think the US has a magic wand. When I became ambassador, I got a nice letter from President Trump saying I was ambassador extraordinary and plenipotentiary, although my children never agreed that I was either extraordinary or plenipotentiary. The president thought I was. But I never got a magic wand. I got a nice letter. It did not give me a magic wand to go in and solve all the problems of the world. And I think that level of humility is important to remember. We can go in and encourage and support, but we can't dictate. But it's important that we do support and encourage. We can't also just write it off.
And again, related to relation between the two and the kind of socioeconomic factors. There's, this one doesn't have a name, that's fine. Some people put it, some don't. How much do they depend on each other in terms of, their economies and trade trade between the two countries? And C, Harris asks, if Pakistan can't overcome its history of hardline extremism, will low levels of socioeconomic development vis-a-vis India perhaps play a role in reducing tensions?
So, I mean, one of the great tragedies about the tension, and obviously the greatest tragedy is the human cost, the people who die and people whose lives are destroyed. But one of the tragedies is also the economic cost. There's very little economic interaction, commercial interaction between India and Pakistan. And that is a huge wasted opportunity. The opportunity of cost of the fact that there are almost no border crossings and the fact that there's so much distrust is just terrible. They're two big, important countries right next door to each other that could be doing so much more. And until those tensions are settled, until there is some sort of modus operandi, that's going to be an opportunity cost that continues, which is really too bad, and it's a huge loss. What will lead one day to the two of them coming together is, I think, just a continuation of these efforts. Like I said, you could make a timeline and just show the violence and the wars and the tension, but you could also make a timeline that just shows how many times they've come to agreements, how many times they've taken a few steps forward. And you have to just hope that eventually 3 steps forward, 1 step back, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, 3 steps forward, 1 step back. You've actually slowly moved forward 3 steps. It took you a hell of a lot of effort. But eventually the belief of diplomats, and diplomats are always optimists, is that those sort of talks and agreements and efforts will eventually make a difference.
And just turning to Pakistan, kind of the current and kind of future outlook for Pakistan. Like these two don't have names. but the first question asks, would you say Pakistan is essentially a failed state? Are they state sponsors of terrorism? How did the U.S. fail in their support of Pakistan? And then related to that, given the continued weaknesses of democratic institutions, Pakistan, what is the likelihood that provinces such as Baluchistan would break away, and given the kind of geopolitical situation in the region?
So I'm going to fall back on my diplomatic training and answer indirectly. First of all, I hate the term failed state. I don't think that's a terribly helpful concept. A state is a state. Some are stronger than others, some are weaker than others. But what I would say is one of the things that's really both inspirational and sad are the number of Pakistanis who are incredibly committed to democratic rule and to civil rights, and who are incredibly creative and both culturally and artistically and economically and commercially, who have amazing hopes and aspirations for Pakistan. And you saw some of that come out in the most recent elections, which the ISI and the military wasn't terribly happy about. But there is that sense and that spirit, right? And so I don't think you can call a state a failed state, or you can say that there's no hope, or that they just need to break off into disparate provinces. Or I think every society and every culture has to work its way through those challenges. And what I would hope, because I believe that secular democracy and diversity and all of that can build a strong culture and a strong state, that those forces are able to have their say. But it's a challenge.
And just quickly, I know it's hard because we've tried to take on so much. For people might be familiar with Imran Khan, the most recent Pakistani prime minister, who's now in jail. Kind of his own incredible story of being an incredible global star for cricket and living a large kind of playboy life for a while. He kind of has over time become much more pious in his belief and become more, I suppose, devout in his Muslim faith. He has become a focal point for a large part of the Pakistani population who feel that the military-run governments are just hugely corrupt and don't represent their values. What is the status of Imran Khan? And I suppose, what does it say that one of the most powerful political figures in the country is in prison?
Not an expert on Imran Khan or his personal history or his personal current religious beliefs or not. But I think it's reflective of that tension in Pakistan between a very powerful military and ISI. A lot of people in the country who feel that the ruling class has become too corrupt and needs to be changed, a search for solutions, whether that's through Islam, whether that's through people like Imran Khan, whether it's through violence. I think what I would just say is I think that reflects very much the tensions that are still very much ongoing in Pakistan.
And then just two more quick questions, just for the sake of time. Rick, just kind of a follow-up to what you discussed earlier with regards to the idea of regional mutual deterrence. He says, in your time as deputy chief of mission in India, I suppose, did you consider the idea of nuclear balance, in that since Pakistan developed its own nuclear program, there's not been a major war between two countries? And in some ways, was this regional version of MAD, mutually assured destruction, maybe in that sense beneficial?
I don't ever think MAD can be beneficial. It's sort of like the idea of failed state. The vocabulary just doesn't work for me. Being mad, being beneficial also is something that I don't like admitting that idea. But I do think that there is some sense of, as I said earlier, both sides recognize that they both now have nuclear capacities, which would be destructive to both sides of the equation. I think what you're seeing more and more, however, is an India that is facing away from Pakistan. In fact, one of the policies of the government was turn east and look east, which was all about engaging with Southeast Asia for economic and commercial reasons. And now you see the Quad, which we talked about, you mentioned briefly, and I didn't talk about, but India playing a role with Australia and Japan and the US in the Indo-Pacific. When I was in India, that's when, not because of me, but when I was in India, it happened to coincide with when we changed PACOM, the Pacific Command, to Indo-PACOM, reflecting that importance regionally. And you see Pakistan still dealing with some of these more fundamental issues.
All right. And before just kind of a last a question, let y'all know again, as Marianne mentioned, great to have you all join us next week if you make it for an excellent dinner called Made in China versus America First, the new economic Cold War between the United States and China with Patrick Genevine, the CEO of Point Bello, who has decades of experience doing business in China. And 2 weeks after that, we'll host a program on El Salvador and President Bukele, who on the great side, he has greatly reduced the gang violence, MS-13, other gangs in El Salvador. The difficult side is he has done a lot of that by incarcerating tens of thousands of people, many of them without trials, without due process. We're hosting a Salvadoran journalist, Gabriel Labrador, who I've been in contact with him for a long time. And actually, when I spoke to him a few weeks ago, we're flying him from El Salvador. He's like, Ronan, I think I'm going to have to leave the country before then. So sadly, because that's the flip side is if the journalist with a kind of autocratic regime, you never know when you get arrested or worse. So he's actually had to flee. I believe now he's in Guatemala, I think. But a very interesting perspective on El Salvador, the mega prisons you've heard about, the U.S. immigration to send certain numbers of American detainees down to El Salvador. Something new and different we're starting. If we're starting a program called Wine and Wisdom, it's a kind of a fun way to meet and network with some people, your fellow members or guests or non-members, and learn kind of a little more about a topic that you might know about, have heard about, don't know a lot about. We'll be hosting Professor Dr. Beverly Barrett on August 20th. And she'll be talking about the European Union. So how does it actually govern? How does it work? How does it trade? And really, how does it really shape the world? It has a lot bigger and more influence in the world than we might realize, but it's also not as kind of crazy and overbearing as some people might consider. And then just a little bit later, when we get back to in the fall, just maybe 2 to look out for. We have a lot of others coming. September 4th, we're going to host former Iranian ambassador and spokesperson for the nuclear talks, Ambassador Syed Mousavian, to talk about Iran and the United States from a very different perspective. He is someone who knows Iran at the highest levels, obviously, but also got on the wrong side of a more extreme government. And he was accused himself of cooperating with the West, and he had to flee and get out of the country. But a unique perspective. And then September 25th, someone you might know from television, longtime Pentagon spokesperson, State Department spokesperson, spokesperson for the National Security Council in the White House. We're going to host retired Admiral John Kirby. And so the last question, Ambassador, is to kind of go back to this. Someone had asked about it. How important is it that India has joined the Quad? And maybe if you could just touch upon a bit of the Quad and maybe your kind of last thoughts on the U.S.'s approach to the region.
Yeah. So the Quad is this grouping, U.S., Australia, India, and Japan, that started very informally to get together and talk about the region, and has now met more and more frequently at higher and higher levels. And it was really, I would say, a really stunning development. Because if you remember, in the 70s, we were talking about India being non-aligned. And so India is still very careful to say it's non-aligned. India is not an ally to the US, but it is now participating in groups like the Quad and talking about common interests. And that is actually a huge shift when it comes to Indian foreign policy. That ability and that willingness and that desire to actually engage with other countries that are aligned. A lot of that comes from something you talked about earlier that we didn't get too much, which was India's concerns about China, which also very much help and support the U.S. developing relationship with India because we share that concern about China. The Indians probably even more than us. And so the Quad is about the Quad. It is not about the U.S. will always tell you it is not about facing China. But the fact of the matter is, if you just look at a map, U.S., India, Japan, just drawing conclusions. So I think it's important in terms of China. It's important in terms of the region, but it's also very important in terms of what we talked about earlier, and India's increasing engagement and increasing ownership of being a really important world power.
Gosh, and I just want to say you've been a great friend of the council. We're lucky to have you here in Houston, and as a country, we're lucky to have your decades of service to the country as a distinguished diplomat for the United States. And will you all please join me in thanking Ambassador Michael Pelletier? Thank you.